Hey there folks, and welcome to the final video for Chapter 27, Reproduction and Embryonic Development. In this last video, we're going to specifically be looking at human development. Up until this point, human development occurs exactly the same as every other sexually reproducing animal, and even more the same as every other sexually reproducing mammal. And in fact, even these later stages of development that we're about to cover are pretty much the same between us and most other mammals. There's a couple weird exceptions. When a human woman is pregnant, she is undergoing gestation, which is the technical term for carrying a developing young within her reproductive system. That developing young is hosted inside her body in the uterus, where slowly a layer of cells called the that start out as something called the trophoblast here will eventually develop into the placenta. The job of the placenta is to interact between the developing embryo and the mother's body. There isn't a direct connection between the developing embryo and the mother's blood system, but the placenta is able to receive nutrients, hormones, and care from the mother's body through her blood and then deliver it to the embryo. At this same time, as the placenta is developing, the embryo implants inside her uterine wall. That's what this layer of cells is here. It's the uterine lining, the epithelium of it. And it inserts into an area called the blastocyst cavity. It's basically a cavity that the blastula forms as it embeds. And this typically, the formation of the blastocyst typically starts within 24 hours after fertilization, and within that 24 hours a blastula will have formed. Everything in that uterine lining and everything in the placenta is from there on out developing in order to cater to, protect, and foster the development of that blastula into a gastrula and into an embryo, eventually from there into a fetus, and if all goes well, eventually into a fully developed baby. What you see at this point is the formation of the amniotic cavity, which is full of amniotic fluid. So here's that amniotic cavity. There's the fluid inside, and here is the yolk sac. Now, mammals don't really have a yolk sac in the way you think of it inside a bird egg or a reptile egg. It's not full of yolk. However, we call it the same thing. It's a homologous structure. It looks the same thing. It looks very much the same, and it does a very similar job. In mammals, the yolk sac, which never really gets very big, it always stays pretty small, does some other things. It produces the embryo's very first blood cells, for instance, as well as its first germ cells. And these are the cells that eventually will develop into that embryo's eggs or sperm later on. If everything goes well, this is what fetal development in humans looks like, which we break down into sets of 3 months called trimesters. The average healthy pregnancy in humans takes about 9 months, or about 38 weeks. There's some variation in here, though. Nobody's really precise. It doesn't happen that way every time. But as you can see, over time, we get formations of things like the heart and the central nervous system. That's what CNS stands for. And as subsequent weeks of development go on, from weeks roughly 3 to 8, we see the first development of the most vital systems inside the embryo. The heart, the eyes, the first formation of the limbs, the central nervous system. Later on, we get the ears. They don't look like a lot yet, but there they are. The teeth, the hard palate inside the mouth. Between week 8 and week 12, We stop referring to the developing individual as an embryo because it has become complex enough where if it were born at this point, it might survive. And instead, we call it a fetus. This is a fetus now, at which point we start to see the formation of exterior genitals. This is when you can finally tell what sex the baby is without checking its DNA, and the formation of the brain. However, there are certain stages in development where something should go wrong. There are specific disorders, developmental disorders, uh, and defects that can happen. If something should happen very early on, remember that's when we're first developing the heart and the central nervous system. That can be very, very severe. However, if something happens later on, at that point we are developing things like the external genitalia. And that may result in some minor structural defects. It's possible, but usually things are still all right when things happen later on. If we continue, if the rest of development occurs as it should, and the pregnancy goes well, eventually that baby has to be born. That baby's got to get out of there somehow. Labor is our term for a series of events that eventually get that infant out of the mother's uterus. Phase one, this is a multi-phase scenario. There's a reason it's called labor. This is a lot of work. This primarily involves a lot of very careful and specific positioning of the baby inside the uterus so that it can be born successfully. And this is done through powerful muscle contractions inside the mother's body around the uterine wall. In the first phase, to get that baby lined up correctly with the entrance to the uterus so that it can be born head first, so that the baby will be able to breathe, and also so that the widest part of the body can be expelled first. When humans are born, we have a very large skull compared to the rest of our body. That's part of what makes human births so hard on human mothers. But making sure that the baby comes out head end first is very important to make sure that the baby doesn't suffocate while it's trying to be born. From there on out, it's just a matter of continuing to keep that baby correctly positioned so that when the muscle contractions squeeze down and press on the uterus and press on that baby, that as it is gradually expelled from the uterus, it doesn't get stuck. Say its shoulders or its hips don't get stuck, and that it can breathe properly once it reaches a certain point. Once the baby is born, here in phase 3, eventually the placenta is also expelled. Remember, that placenta isn't necessary anymore. The whole purpose of the placenta is to support the baby while it's developing. Well, once it's out of the body, it's still connected to the placenta through the umbilical cord. And after the baby is born, eventually that placenta is also expelled from the uterus. If it wasn't enough that childbirth is difficult for humans, there's a lot of other things that can be difficult just in trying to become pregnant in the first place. Infertility, which is the inability to have a baby, can take a number of forms. Both men and women can be infertile. A woman's eggs may be unviable, or she may have her body may have a difficulty getting eggs from her ovary out into the uterus. A man's sperm may be infertile. They may have structural issues. They may not be able to swim well. They may not be formed correctly. There's a number of different ways in which either men or women can become infertile. Sometimes it's due to health issues. Sometimes it's genetic. However, because of modern technology, we do have a number of ways to assist potential parents who are having difficulty having a baby. These are called assisted reproductive technologies. Things like in vivo fertilization, which is when a man's sperm may be directly injected uh, into a woman at the right time of her cycle to try and really increase the odds of a successful fertilization, just to help the sperm get there. Or even things like in vitro fertilization. Now, in vivo means in life, so it happens inside the woman's body. In vitro means that this happens in a lab. So eggs are taken from the woman's body and they are fertilized in a lab to guarantee a successful fertilization. So sperm is carefully added to an egg or to some eggs in a lab setting. That way, a fertilization specialist, a doctor with a careful specialty in this, can just guarantee a successful fertilization. And then one of those newly formed zygotes is re-implanted inside the mother's body, and her body then takes over from there to take care of the embryo. All right, folks, this is going to wrap it up for Chapter 27, and I will see you next time. Bye, folks.